OG Rose here, and today we're going to be talking about a paper called Austin Farah in the Problems of Verifiable Education. And it's going to be inspired heavily by William Wilson's Dissertations of Proof of the Faith. And I think a great way to sort of start the conversation is with this wonderful quote from Schopenhauer that I've always liked, where he says, "However, for the man who studies to gain insight, books and studies are merely rungs of the ladder on which he climbs to the summit of knowledge. As soon as a rung has raised him up one step, he leaves it behind. On the other hand, the many who study in order to fill their memory do not use the rungs of the ladder for climbing, but take them off and load themselves with them to take away, rejoicing at the increasing weight of the burden. They remain below forever, because they bear what should have borne them." I always love that image of someone who uses a ladder to climb toward something and someone who comes along and uses a ladder to pull off the rungs in order to collect them in a bag to show them off. And I think this does unfortunately describe a lot of education today where, especially graduate work, and I'm obviously not talking about every graduate school. I haven't been, and I'm sure there are plenty of good ones. But a lot of times we go in to become, say, a Karl Barth scholar or a Balthasar scholar, as opposed to trying to understand the truth that Balthasar, Aquinas, Karl Barth, Tolstoy, or whoever was after. We become experts in a thinker as opposed to engage with thinkers in order to figure out what they were on. Austin Farah had this great idea where he says, the genius is in the fingertips. It knows not what it does. And what he meant by that is a lot of times the great minds and thinkers in history, they are captured by a vision. They're on something, and they don't really fully know what they're trying to say. They have a sense of it, but it's in the act of pursuing it that they can articulate better this thing that they've been captured by, this sort of vision. And there's a sense in which they see the whole thing from the start, but there's also another sense in which they do not. But if someone came along and they told, say, Tolstoy, to prove to them that Tolstoy was going to write War and Peace before he wrote War and Peace, the concern is that Tolstoy couldn't pass the test, and he would never thus be allowed to write War and Peace because he couldn't verify ahead of time that he was on something worthwhile until the project was done. And this gets into the problem of verifiable education. We learned from Karl Popper in general that verification is impossible. But today it's almost like you're not allowed to pursue studies of something unless you can first verify that the studies are worth pursuing, which I would argue many of the great works in history have not been able to verify themselves until they were complete. And if that's the case, then perhaps many graduate schools would keep people from being the next Tolstoy or Karl Barth or something like that. But then there's also this interesting idea that we become, say, a Barth scholar, and our dissertation is verified against the Barthian system to prove that it's an accurate reading of Karl Barth. I think that's how a lot of dissertations work. I'm not trying to say all of them, but if you're writing a dissertation on Karl Barth, then you verify it against the Barth system. But if verification is impossible, then no matter how much you read Karl Barth or how many hours you pour into it, you can never be completely sure that what you write is completely what Barth said, or you can't ever verify it. And if we accept the very problematic fallacy that the only things with meaning are the things that can be verified, then there's going to be potentially a lot of insight and thought that we consider meaningless because it can't be verified when verification in general is basically impossible. Now, things can be falsified, and there's some room there to, falsify a premise about what Karl Barth thought in light of a Barthian system. But verification, if we're reading to verify, as opposed to, say, reading to learn or reading to figure out what a thinker was on or to be on the same thing, well, then we're going to be going in circles in a long time, and education might not feel as fulfilling as it should. And there's also this kind of idea that, like, when Karl Barth wrote, there was no Barth system against which his writing could be verified and approved of. His ideas had to be read on their own terms and considered in light of their own intelligibility and depth, not to the degree the writings could be judged and verified as accurately representing and understanding Karl Barth. For Karl Barth to write as Karl Barth at the time was him to kind of stumble ahead with only a vague vision, a vague sense of what his fingertips led him to use that idea. And if graduate programs fall under the fallacy of requiring a verifiable premise to allow someone to begin their studies, then we might be losing a generation of Karl Barth's, Tolstoy's, Aquinas's, Aristotle's, and not even realize it because the system of education does not make space for people to pursue their own quote-unquote vague visions. And also it can be problematic if graduate schools require people to read to verified as opposed to read to trace. I make this distinction between philosophy that verifies and philosophy that traces. And by that I mean this kind of philosophical pursuit where we're trying to verify what people thought as opposed to trying to trace out what they thought so that we could have thoughts of our own. What we really need to do is, instead of trying to become an expert Aquinas reader, we need to try to get on, to use Austin Farrer's language, we need to get on what Aquinas was on and pursue that truth. But if we don't, if we don't believe in truth or beauty or these different things, then I guess all that's left is to become a Tolstoy scholar or someone like that. But I would go on a limb and suggest that people like the great minds and great thinkers, they certainly believed in some kind of vision, some kind of thing that they were on. And if the programs that we're in today don't allow writing under that pretense, there's kind of a strange mismatch between the scholars of, say, Aristotle and Aristotle himself in regard to motivation. So there are significant consequences. There's something to say, well, in order to judge something in light of truth, then you'd have to know truth, and that's very, very difficult. But I might suggest that there could be other rubrics where instead of trying to verify something in light of a Aristotelian system, we instead could judge works on their own internal consistency. Into the regard that there are no essential contradictions and that they provide helpful, say, mental models for understanding truth, beauty, and goodness. And we can find, in any of the great books, you can find mental models or tools by which to approach truth, goodness, and beauty, and that this would prove perhaps more useful than an education that's trying to verify readings. There's this nice Japanese poet, Basso, I believe, who said something like, "I do not seek to follow in the footsteps of the men of old. I seek the things they sought." I think that sums up nicely what Austin Farrer believed we needed to do in education and what myself think. And also, I actually think it honors the great men and women of history when we try to pursue what they were after. I do not think Aquinas wrote hoping that someone would write a dissertation on him one day. He wrote to help people know God. I don't think Hannah Arendt wrote so that she could be someone's subject for a PhD dissertation. I think she wrote in order to stop the next Nazi Germany from rising to power. And so I think we actually honor the will of these great minds when we seek what they sought as opposed to seek them. For more, please visit ogrose.com, and thank you for your time.